So far on this channel, we've covered quite a bit of Shopify Liquid, but in order to allow the user to update the UI without reloading the page, we're going to need to use JavaScript. JavaScript is essential in Shopify theme development, as Shopify Liquid, the language that allows us to access the data layer of our store, is only executed on the server side. Using JavaScript, we can add features like front-end variant switching, lazy loading, and so much more. Basically, any interaction on the front end that you see on a Shopify store relies on JavaScript code. So in this video, let's talk about how to use JavaScript inside Shopify themes and talk about two ways we can pass data from Shopify's backend for use on our front end. So the fundamental concept you need to understand here before we can dive into JavaScript is the difference between front end and back end when it comes to web development. If you're not familiar with the distinction between back end and front end web development, I encourage you to check out lesson 4 of my Skillshare class, Understanding Web Development, A Beginner's Guide to the Web. Otherwise, to give you a quick summary, the front end code is what you can see and edit in your browser. So when you see me using Chrome DevTools, I'm able to see the CSS, the HTML, and the JavaScript in my browser and edit it on the fly. The backend code, Shopify Liquid in this instance, never makes it to the browser. Now that we've established the need for JavaScript, let's talk about how and where we write JavaScript. Well, just like any website project, we can either include an opening and closing script tag anywhere we include HTML in our code base. We can store it as a separate JavaScript file and include it where necessary. I'll show you how to do this in Shopify very shortly. If executing JavaScript based on an event, we can also insert the code directly inside a HTML element, although this is not a very common option.
So if we look inside our debut theme here, we'll be able to find at least the first two examples. So what we're looking for the first example is any .liquid file that contains HTML. So all of these should contain a mix of HTML and Shopify Liquid. If we look at theme.liquid, we can scroll down and we can see that there's an opening script tag and a closing script tag here. And inside there is JavaScript. So wherever this template loads, in this case, this is the theme.liquid template. So that is a layout file. So it's going to basically show up everywhere. That JavaScript that's written in between these script tags will execute. And we can make sure of that by putting in our own script tag right here and just outputting a simple console log. If I hit save on that and then preview that, if I go into my DevTools, you can see here, if I zoom in, script loaded. There you go. So you can basically put JavaScript wherever you can put HTML in your template files, okay? Another way to store JavaScript or to include JavaScript in a project, which is generally considered best practice, is to have a dedicated JavaScript file. And in Debut, you can see that in the assets folder. So if I go down here to theme.js, you can see a file full of JavaScript. Now, how do we include this JavaScript in our actual code base? That's pretty simple. We can look over here into our layout file and let's search for theme.js. Here you can see we have a script tag that loads an external resource, the theme.js file, and the way we find the full asset URL is using this asset URL filter right here. And if we look at that again in our output code, if I go over, inspect the page, let's type in theme.js, and here you can see the script tag with the fully formed URL. Remember, in our code base, we just use the file name itself, not the full URL. We require this filter, and then that will resolve to the full URL that's stored on the Shopify CDN. So those are two ways we can include JavaScript in our project. The third and not so common way is to insert a JavaScript function onto an event handler on the actual element itself. I'm not sure if there's any examples here, but if we go to the product template, for instance, over here, let's preview that. Then I'm going to go into the catalog. Let's select a product to look at. And let's inspect this paragraph here. So this paragraph has a class of product-single__description. So I'm going to go find that in our code base. Here we go. And then we can put on an event handler right on the element. On click, let's just say alert, hello. So this should be very familiar to you if you already know how to use JavaScript in any other project. It's pretty much exactly the same in Shopify. We just need to know where to include external JavaScript files. So if I click on that, you can see we get an alert with hello. All right. So that's the 3 ways that we can insert JavaScript into our Shopify theme. Like I said, anywhere where we insert HTML, which is on any of these .liquid files, we can also insert JavaScript. And for including external files, maybe we want to add in a new JavaScript file here. So I'm going to click create blank file, go down to JS, just call it custom.js. Let's say, for instance, we had this custom.js, and let's just do the same thing again. Alert loaded, save on that. And then all we would need to do to include that asset, as long as it's in the asset folder, is to just copy the same format that we had down here. So I can just copy this. And then instead of theme.js, we're going to look for custom.js. So let's refresh the page in our preview. And there you go. We've got the alert with loaded. So there you go, guys. That's how you insert JavaScript into a Shopify theme. Very simple, exactly how you would do it in basically anything, but we just need to know how to use that filter right here for when we include an asset URL.
So now we know where to insert JavaScript in our project. The question then becomes how we start to access the store data and the theme data that we would typically use Shopify Liquid for. Remember, once the page is loaded, we can no longer use Shopify Liquid, so we need another way to access data from our Shopify backend. For that, we have 2 options. Let's take a look at the most common option first.
To learn about best practice when it comes to developing Shopify themes, I think it's a good idea to look at the themes developed by Shopify themselves, like the debut theme here, which comes by default currently on new store installs. I want to draw your attention to a particular part of this theme, so I'm going to click to preview in a new tab. This is actually the live theme, so this is not really a preview theme at all. It is just looking at the current website. But if I go into catalog here and I click on this product, Awesome Sneakers, I want to draw your attention to what we have over here. We have 2 options and we have a selection for both. So we've got 5 sizes to choose from and we've got 2 colors. Now, if you understand variants are very important in Shopify. It's basically a unique combination of these options. So if you can imagine, if I order a size 8 red shoe and I get delivered a size 12 black shoe, then those are different products to the end user, right? So it's important to note here, it's the variant that needs to get determined and then sent to the shopping cart, and that is what gets sent to the customer, okay? So what I want you to notice here is when I change these options, I want you to notice that the price changes right here in certain instances, and the variant ID gets added up here to the URL and then updates when I change my variant selection. So as you can see, if I go to 12, we've got now a price of 140 and the variant ID is changing up here. So this is the ID of the actual variant, the actual product that's going to get added to our cart. The other thing I want you to notice is that the page is not reloading at all. And that means that we are using JavaScript here. Remember, Shopify Liquid only executes on the server side. So once it's executed, we would have to reload the page in order to get new variant information. Well, what's happening instead is that we have this variant information stored somewhere, and JavaScript is actually working with it on the front end. So let's take a look at how this works behind the scenes. So if I go over here, let's click over to the assets folder and click on theme.js, and I'll show you where all of these functions are taking place. If I search for slate or slate.variants, you can see here that this is where all our variant selection scripts are happening. As it reads here, all of this code handles change events from the variant inputs in any cart add forms that may exist. It also updates the master select and triggers updates when the variant's price or image changes. So what is this master select? That's one thing that we haven't covered yet. So I'm going to go over here, and if I right click on our form here, I want to show you something that you may not have realized. Right here is the master select. If I look at its attributes here, you can see it's set to display none. I'm going to change that and set it to display block. And now you can see it's got the variant selection, which is the combination of the two options that we selected. And if I change these over here, you'll see our master select gets changed as well. So we don't actually need to see this on the front end, which is why it's hidden. But in terms of submitting the ID to the form, this is what we need. So we need to determine which of these variant IDs is going to go into our cart. Okay, so that's something happening behind the scenes in order to actually have this operation where we have two options and then we determine the variant from them. We need to use JavaScript, which is what is happening right here. All right, so hopefully this is not going too in depth. I'm not going to go into the line by line code here, but what I want you to gather from this is that we have all the functions here that are doing what we saw over here. So we have a function for getting the current options. We then have a function for using those current options to get the variant from those options. We've got the event handler, so when a select changes, we can handle that right here with this code. If the variant is linked to an image, then we're going to switch the image in the product carousel to that image. That's not happening in this particular instance. Updating the price, which we saw before, right here. What else? We've got updating the SKU. In our instance here, we don't have an SKU showing. And update the history state. So that's what's happening here in the URL. We're seeing the URL change here with the variant ID. If I refresh the page with that variant ID in there, you can see it saves our selection, okay? Oh, and one more for the updating the master select, okay? So how is this working? Where is it getting this data from in order to update the selector? Well, it's all happening from this product single object. So if we look at this product single object, you can see it's taking something from the page and parsing it into a JSON format, okay? So where is it getting this? Let me show you. Let's go into our product template, and then let's go into our section product template where we have the code inside. And I'm going to look for JSON. Here you can see we have outputted the product object, but then we've run it through the JSON filter, which will output the product as JSON. Okay, so let me have a look inside our code base on the front end. If I look for that product JSON, you can see here that our product object in JSON format is all here, right? So this is all the data that our slate.variants set of functions needs in order to provide all this functionality. Now there's a lot of code going on here, so I'm not going to reproduce this, but just to understand the core principle that what we're doing here is we're exposing the product object into a JSON format, And that is what allows us to grab that data and use it in JavaScript. So when the page loads, it looks for this particular script tag with the ID of product JSON, the section ID, and it grabs that product JSON. Then it has all the data it needs to perform those calculations. So if we search this again, we can see that it then becomes the product on this options container. And then we can see that this options container is going to be passed into slate.variance. And then inside slate.variance, again, bit of a rabbit hole, but if we trace it back, we can see that we're putting options into here, and then we're grabbing this .product off options.product, and then we're using, if we scroll down here, the variance on that product object to determine what variance we have, and then we're grabbing the selected values and creating a match between the variance that we have in that object and the selected values. So again, lots going on here. I don't expect you to understand every line of code if you're a beginner, but this is how we are exposing some data to the front end and are able to use it in JavaScript. And just to prove that is the case, let's go where this product single object. Let's go here where it is actually assigned, and let's console log that value. Console log this product single object. I'm going to hit save, and now if we refresh the page, open up our console here, you can see this product single object. I've actually already got a console log in there for this product single object. Here you can see it down here. So I'm outputting it twice, but you can see here is the object, and if we go inside, we've got access to all of this information on the front end, which is awesome. All right, we got the images, we've got the options, we've got the tags, the variance, obviously very important for this particular feature. But the main principle here is that we're able to pass information from our backend to our front end in a JavaScript readable format using the JSON filter. So if you want to learn more about the JSON filter, we can find it, Shopify Liquid JSON filter. You can find out about it on the Shopify documentation. It converts a string into JSON format. So handy anytime you want to convert, an object into JSON, you can use this JSON formatter right here. So that's really cool. That is the main way, the easiest way you can get data about products and other objects from your Shopify store into your front end to use with JavaScript. But there is one other way, which is to use an API. So in the next section, we'll introduce what's called the Storefront API, and I'll show you how we can pull information from our backend using that API as opposed to using Shopify Liquid with the JSON filter. Another option for bringing your Shopify backend data onto the front end and for use in JavaScript is to use the Shopify Storefront API. As it reads here, the Storefront API gives you full creative control to add Shopify buying experiences anywhere your customers are, including websites, apps, and video games. The thing to note here about the Storefront API, however, is that it's useful when Shopify merchants have custom requirements not met by existing channels like online store or POS. Essentially, it's not really an API that is provided to you in order to do Shopify theme development, but it is an option. You can use it to bring data from your Shopify backend within a Shopify theme. It's just that it's intended more for, off-site websites, apps, and video games. For instance, if I go to, you might have seen this one before, I talk about it in some of my other classes and videos. This is my custom storefront app, and I won't log into it now, but as you can see, you can add a store domain and a storefront access token, and what happens is once you're logged in, you can see your store data presented on a third-party app. It's a pretty cool feature. Again, not really intended for developing on a Shopify theme itself. It does require a lot more configuration, but again, it is an option that I wanted to present in this video. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back over to, let's go into our product template. And let's bring in, if we go, let's write it here in this file actually. I'm going to open up an opening and closing script tag, and I'm going to copy and paste some code in here to make a connection to the storefront API. So to explain this code a little bit, we've got the product handle, and we use the product handle to query the storefront API in this API call over here. And then we're going to console log the response. Obviously a lot going on here, and I just summarized it in 2 seconds. Again, we're not going to go into full detail here. As you can see, this is quite a bit of code, and we also need to add in a storefront access token. So what we need to do for that is I'm going to go in and create a private app. You may have done this before when creating a theme kit connection. But if we go down to here to manage private apps, I already have one here, but let's create a new one just so you guys can see. And we'll call it storefront API connection. Put in my email here. And what we're looking for is this checkbox here. Allow this app to access your storefront data using the storefront API. You can allow or disallow certain permissions here. I'm just going to hit save. It warns you about providing access to your store data. I'm going to create the app anyway. And then down here, it'll give you your storefront access token. So I'm going to copy that, go back over to here, and in this little field here, I'm going to paste in my storefront access token. So let's see what happens when we now run the page. If I preview that in a new tab, let's go to the awesome sneakers product again, and let's open up our console, have a look inside. All right, so we've got this object here, and inside we've got a data object, and inside we've got a product by handle object. This is our call to the storefront API. So if I click on this, you can see that is the code that is console logging the response. And if I go into my network tab, let's actually drag this out a bit more. And let's refresh the page. We can actually see that request happening. So I'm going to filter by XHR, and you can see here, this is the endpoint for the storefront API. So I've hit this API, I've sent this payload, which is the GraphQL query that we just saw here. And then we are getting back the response, which is all of the things that we asked for. So in GraphQL is a whole new technology in itself. So I don't expect you to necessarily know GraphQL, but essentially how it works is we have to specify each of the fields that we want the request to return back. So if we need the description HTML, the online store URL, we actually have to specifically request it in our GraphQL query. All right, so as you can see here, everything that we have requested has come back. And so now we can use that data in our front-end code with JavaScript. Again, it is nested deep within this data and then product by handle, and it doesn't know what the product is unless we feed it the actual product handle. So it's a lot less intuitive than using the other approach that we saw before. Again, this is not intended to be used on Shopify themes, but if you're feeling adventurous and you want to dig around the reference here, you want to learn about GraphQL and all the different things that you can pull from your backend onto the front end using this API, you can read more about it here on the Shopify documentation. But this is also another option. This is an API that Shopify provides and allows you to grab data from your backend and put it on any public front end. It doesn't have to be a Shopify theme. In fact, it's not intended to be used on a Shopify theme. So that is an option as well.
As you can see, this is more complicated because number one, we need to establish a connection via an access token that is set up in a private app. Number 2, we need to use a GraphQL query and specify all the fields that we require. And number 3, the API has no idea about what template it's being run on, so we need to provide the specific product in this instance. In fact, the Storefront API, as mentioned, was not designed to be used on themes, so most of the time it doesn't make sense to use it. There is one other API that Shopify provides called the AJAX API. The main purpose of this API is to provide a way to add and remove items from a shopping cart using JavaScript, but also it is used to display relevant product recommendations and power dynamic search. This API is unauthenticated and works only on Shopify themes.
The AJAX API is used on a lot of themes in order to provide more interactive cart features. For instance, on this debut theme, if I click Add to Cart, once we've selected a variant, you can see that now I have one item in my cart and it knows what item is in there. So I can either continue shopping or have a look at my cart by going to the cart page. All right. If I go to continue shopping, and let's say, for instance, I add a black leather bag as well. If I click Add to Cart, there you can see it is added and it knows I now have 2 products in my cart. We know that this is using the AJAX API because if I go into my network tab over here and I filter by XHR, I can see that it's hitting these endpoints for the AJAX API. The 2 most common ones you'll find is add and cart. Add will add a product to the cart, and cart.js itself will return the cart. So if I click on this, you can go down to here and look at what is being sent. All that's being sent is the ID of the variant that's going to be added to the cart. And then you can see that it returns back the object. All right, so the object that just got added to the cart is now coming back all the information, the handle, the image, and that is presumably what is being used up here in this little box. Then we are running cart.js, and this gives us the total cart information. So as you can see here, we know the item count, and therefore we can put it here in this button. So if I close this, you can see that this number up here, inside the dot with our little cart icon there, is also updated. All right, so what we're doing is interacting with our cart object on the back end using JavaScript, and we can do that via the AJAX API. Let's demonstrate this. So let's go remove those items from our cart. This is also using the AJAX API, as you can see over here. This is another endpoint, which is change.js. So I encourage you to dig around and have a look. You can see it is set line 1 to quantity of 0, and therefore the item count 0. All right, so there is the AJAX API working there. But what I'm going to do is move over to the console, and let's go back to a product. Again, these messages here get a bit annoying, but let's actually select a variant, and by doing so, we will get the variant ID up here. Now, all we need in order to submit an item to the cart using the AJAX API is a variant ID. That's it. We also need a quantity, but we can assume that it's going to be a quantity of 1 if no other option is provided. So let's go back in here and let's have a look under reference. And the main function, as I said, is cart, but you can also fetch information about a product. You can also display product recommendations using this AJAX API, and it also provides predictive search. But the main function is these cart functions, all right? So here you can see if we send a post request to this endpoint, this will add 1 or multiple variants to the cart. And we just need to send it as an object like this, okay? So we can serialize our form like this, or we can throw in the object as it is, okay? We don't need to use items, I don't think. We can do a singular item as well. So that's what we'll do in this case. So let's actually make sure that we have jQuery on this particular theme. Looks like we do. Just double checking in case you're using another theme. And so what I'm going to do is open up a post request. We're going to do post. Then we're going to go to cart. We'll do /cart add.js. You can see I've written this before, so it's coming up in the suggestions above. And then I'm going to put in the object. So the object is ID of this. And then the quantity of 1. And then what I'm going to do is put a chain a dot then on there. And then we can do a function data and then console log back the data. Okay. Fortunately, we didn't get our console log back, but we didn't get any errors either. So if I go into our network tab over here, you can see that the add.js endpoint was hit. We sent the ID and the quantity, status code 200, it worked, and we get the response back, which is the actual variant object that gets added. So we just added the awesome sneakers in size 10 red to our cart. So if we didn't get it in the console, we can look it over in network tab. And the other thing we can do is just run a GET request to the cart endpoint. So I think I've had it saved here. If I run that, again, the data is not coming back in a console log. But if we go over to our network tab here, we can see we've made a request to this cart.js endpoint. And if I scroll down, you can see we haven't sent anything to it, but we do get back the current cart object. You can see that we've got in our items array that variant that we saw before that we just added, right? So we're doing this all ourselves, just using a few simple AJAX API requests. As you can see here, other stuff on the page hasn't been updating because actually inside the debut theme, when these functions execute, it's doing some other stuff like updating the UI. But for our purposes, we can see here that we have added an item to the cart, and then when we retrieve the cart using the AJAX API, that the item is in there. And to verify this, if we did click on our cart, we can see that that product has been added. And if I hit remove, you can see change.js is running. If I go back into console and I get my cart, head over to network, check on the response from that, you can see our item count is now 0. So whether you look on your website or you use the AJAX API over here, you'll get the same result. So this keeps it in sync with the result you get from Shopify Liquid. You're actually editing backend information by using this API. So yeah, you have as much control as you would using Shopify Liquid, but with this handy API. Again, this is mainly just for interacting with the cart. You can't actually do a lot of other things like, grab collections or anything, but you can do some other stuff like go into this, and if you know your product handle, you can go in and get some information about a certain product. So we could still get variant information using this. So this could be another option instead of using the Shopify Liquid JSON filter. But the AJAX API, bit limited of an API. It allows us to do certain things through JavaScript in our Shopify themes, but it's a handy one to have and works well alongside Shopify Liquid. In this video, we looked at where we can write JavaScript in our Shopify themes and a few ways we can access data from our Shopify store without reloading the page. I hope that this has provided some insight into what is going on behind the scenes of a typical Shopify theme. If you would like to learn more about using JavaScript in Shopify themes, definitely check out my Skillshare class, Shopify Theme Programming, Liquid JSON and JavaScript, which I'll link up in the description below. As always, if you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section below, and I look forward to seeing you on the next video.